Hey guys, it's Nolly here, and in this video we're going to be taking a look at the One Kit Wonder Aggressive Rock drum library. And I'm going to be taking a look at this question which I've seen a few people asking, which is about how much mixing do you need to do to it in order for it to sound good? And I'm hoping to show you that the answer is not really anything. So let's dive into my Logic session here. I've just got a couple of riffs that I've written. They're not that aggressive, they're kind of like a good time rock feel. And as you can see, it's quite a simple project. I've literally just got bass, two guitars, and drums. Before we go any further, let's take a little listen to how this is sounding, and then I'll break down what I've got going on in the mix, and you'll see it's very little. And there you have it. I mean, I think that's sounding pretty good. Maybe not like a final commercially mixed record, but if this was a demo or something, or if I got sent this as pre-production, or even to be honest, if I heard this on a record on Spotify or on YouTube, I think it sounded pretty decent. So let's dive in, and first of all, let's take a look at the drums. So we've got the One Kit Wonder Aggressive Rock pack here, and I'm literally just using it with the default preset that it has when it's starting up. So that's 00 default, parallel, and master EQ engaged, and I haven't changed anything. We've got, there's no options, as you know, with One Kit Wonder, so it's just the same kit that everyone else is using. You can see the faders are pretty much at unity across through the close mics, with the overheads and the room mics pulled back a little bit. And crucially, I've got the parallel, which is a parallel compression, and the master EQ, which is adding lifts in both the top and the bottom end of the spectrum. I've got both of those engaged. If I just solo the drums, I'll have them not on, and then you'll hear the difference. Once I put them on, I'll just hit playback. And I think those two controls there are really crucial to being able to get your One Kit Wonder to sound good in the mix without having to do anything else. So firstly, we've got both of them disengaged. Then I'll put on the parallel compression and then the master EQ so you can hear the difference. So hopefully you can hear that the parallel compression is giving a little bit of extra smack to the drum shells, and it's also increasing the amount of ambience that you're hearing, and that's a big factor in getting the drums to sound good in the mix. It could be that in solo the drums don't need that parallel compression, or you'd be listening to them and thinking that they don't really need any extra ambience. But once you put them in the mix with bass, and especially with guitars, those tend to eat up a lot of the low-level ambience that you can hear when the drums are soloed, and the result is you tend to just hear like the flappy character of the attack of the drums. So, and then the master EQ is giving us that top end sheen, a bit of low end kind of heft. I always find that when I go from not having it engaged to on, I almost prefer how it sounded before, because it feels like you've lost quite a lot of mid-range when you engage that EQ. But in the context of a mix, I find it's pretty crucial to getting things sounding kind of commercial. That said, if your mix is particularly dark, or you just like dark mid-rangey mixes, you might find you don't need that master EQ, and it's there for you to leave on or off as you should see fit. So those are the drums. Let's take a look next at the bass. So I've got the Neural DSP Parallax plugin. This is a great one-stop shop bass sound, basically in a single plugin. It's got multiple bands, so you can have like a very clean low end, you can have a distorted mid-range and top end, and it blends it all together and adds a cabinet simulation. It's just a wicked plugin. I've used it quite a bit on professional productions, as well as if I just want to throw one plugin on and have a good bass sound. I find that this often does the trick. So let's start off just by listening to the raw DI. Now, this was tracked with one of my Dingwall basses, and you know, this was all done pretty quickly, really. There's no edits on there. There's no like hardcore bass tracking. I wasn't putting like huge amount of effort into plucking every string super hard or anything. Just you know, jamming around at home. So this is how the DI sounds. So you can hear what the preset which I've got here, it's called Warm Rock Bass, and I'm going to make this available to you guys if you want to check it out. I think it's just a good sounding starting point. It's not too bright or anything. It adds quite a lot of upper mid-range. It adds that kind of distorted, grindy character to the top. But I think most importantly, it gives you that very consistent low end, which is just key with bass, because if your kind of fundamental tone is changing in volume between every note as you move it, it just kind of gives this very inconsistent quality to your mix, and that's one big thing that makes it sound not super professional. To me, professional mixes with great bass tracks have this this super solid character to the low end, where you can hear the fundamental of the bass just tracking at the same volume throughout the part. So that's what I'm using for my kind of general sound for my bass, but I found that perhaps the low end is not quite as deep as I'd like. It's kind of focused a bit higher up in the range. It's sounding a little bit scooped, and some of that upper mid-range I'm not particularly loving. And while there is a graphic equalizer here in the plugin, I decided that it would be better to attack this with like an EQ plugin separately. So here's my plugin. I'm using the FabFilter Pro Q3. And as you can see, I've got something which looks rather like a suspension bridge. We've got like a boost around 60 Hertz, so that's adding the depth that I was talking about before. I'm cutting a bit of that 155 area, which is that kind of upper bass range that I was describing. Maybe the bass is kind of focused a bit higher up than I'd normally go for. Boosting some mids at around 600. That's just a kind of broadband. Just brings forwards the lower mid-range of the bass, and to me that makes it sound a bit more pleasant. Cutting a bit of that upper mid-range spike, that's about 2.25k. And then I'm also adding a boost up at 8k, so that's quite high up. That's beyond the spectrum of what maybe the speaker and microphone would be creating on the bass track. And this is just to give it a bit of extra sizzle, so that it sounds good alongside the rest of the track. Okay, so I'm going to hit play now, and I'm going to show you the difference that this EQ is making. I'm going to use the bypass switch here in the bottom of the plugin. So first of all, bypassed. So that's kind of revoiced the sound of the bass quite a lot. I mean, it's still got the same kind of character, and even the same character that you could hear present in the DI track itself. But I think it's now just sounding a bit more kind of final to me. And let's check it out with the drums. I'll solo off the drums, and you can hear how it sits with and without the EQ. So first, no EQ. So I think it's really interesting, that mid-range boost, this 600 one here. It wasn't that audible when you were hearing it in solo. It wasn't like, whoa, there's suddenly loads of mids. But when you're hearing it next to the drums, I found that the big difference when I engaged the plugin was suddenly you could hear that like wah kind of that frequency range coming through with the drums. And that's kind of why I find that bass requires a bit of extra mid-range. If it's too scooped out, it tends to just blend in with the drum track, and it doesn't really cut through and have a unique voice. So that's what that's doing there. So that's the bass track. Let's take a listen to the guitars now. So these were tracked, I didn't even track a DI for this. This was just guitar into my Friedman Dirty Shirley amplifier. It's a Les Paul into a Mesa Boogie cab. And again, just you know, quickly doing things down. You can see I've copy pasted this second half. And each guitar channel doesn't actually have any mixing going on it. It's just straight up. And then I have an EQ on the bus for the two of them. So let's listen just without the EQ to begin with. Or in fact, I'm going to do what I did last time and use the EQ bypass in the plugin. Here's the raw sound of the guitars. Sounding pretty good. Let's actually check out what it sounds like in the mix without the EQ. Just listening to it, it sounds a little bit soft and kind of a bit fuzzily, but it's a great character on the guitars. I like that tone a lot. It's very smooth in the top end. And that's both the amp and the cab. They're just really great sounding. So again, EQ off. I'll show you what that sounds like. It sounds good. It's not like there's anything hugely wrong with it, but I'm feeling like those mids are coming through a bit too much. It's lacking a little bit of top end to blend in with the cymbal. So that's exactly what I'm adding here. When I unbypass the plugin, you can see I've got a little scoop. It's only 2 dB at 350 hertz. As a little note, I think that the mid-range of the guitar, I mean, a distorted guitar has just got such a huge frequency range. It's so non-dynamic that small cuts around the mid-range go a really long way. I personally tend to be making moves of around 1 or 2 dB when I'm EQing the mids on my guitars. I find that if you need to do more than that, I mean, look, if you've been sent something to mix and the track just sounds weird and you need to totally revoice the mid-range, fair enough. But if I'm creating the guitar tone, then I typically will just do it again, or turn up the mids on the amp, or turn down the mids on the amp, or try something different, move the microphone until it's not really necessary to do more than 1 or 2 moves around that kind of like 1-2 dB increment, whether it's boosting or cutting, although personally I tend to cut more than boost in general. So yeah, that's 350 hertz, which is that kind of congested sounding, or just kind of like woolly sounding mid-range. And then I'm adding a bit of extra sparkle. This is a bit similar to what we did on bass, this time at 10K, and it's 4 dB, which sounds like a lot, but because of the way that a guitar speaker and microphone rolls off quite severely after about 5 or 6K, you need to do quite a large boost in the top end to offset that. So don't be scared by the fact that I was just talking about keeping it to 1 or 2 dB, and then here I've done a 4 dB boost. It's because there's not very much information there, and on some mixes I've been known to boost, like 6-7 dB up there. And for those people that are familiar with my normal mixing style and are familiar with the fact that I use top-down EQ a lot, so my master bus has an EQ built onto it, which is boosting high end, and all of my instruments are going through that. I'm not doing that here. So there is no top-down EQ. The EQ that you're seeing on these guitars is the extent of any equalization that's happening to them. And we'll take a little look at my very minimal master bus setup in a second. Okay, so 10K, 4 dB boost, 350 hertz, 2 dB cut. Let's solo off the guitars, and I'll start with the bypass and then introduce that EQ move so you can hear. It's one of those funny things. It's just like with the master EQ on the drums. I find that the darker sound is more pleasing when you directly A/B them. And this is something which I find a lot if I've been spending some time dialing in tones. And sometimes if I'm not working on any mixing for clients or for myself, I might just be messing around with tones for weeks on end. And I find that when I then get to mix, I'm kind of shy away from doing these kinds of moves, like cutting the mid-range and boosting the high end, because my ears have just gotten so attuned to the fullness and the warmth that you can get with raw tones. And then you do a mix and you don't add the high end and you don't cut the mids, and everything just sounds really kind of flat and mid-rangey. So I'm saying this because I think that this kind of exemplifies one of the key differences between engineering and mixing. I think when you're engineering, you often will capture these great, rich, warm source tones. I mean, obviously, if it's too dark, then that's not a good thing. But the raw tones you capture will definitely not have the hype and excitement that the tones will need in the mix if they want to compete on a commercial level. And I think it's quite difficult to reset your ears if you've gotten really attached to the raw tones. Sometimes it's just worth taking a bit of time. Or, like I normally do, and like I mentioned earlier, I'll have a top-down EQ on my master bus once I get to mixing. So as soon as I open my session and hit play, everything's got a bit more sheen and low end to it, and I don't need to kind of readjust my ears for that. Cool, so let's take a listen to this EQ move with the guitars in context in the rest of the mix. So first of all, bypassed. Yeah, I think it's not a huge difference, but what I hear is that mid cut is increasing the width of the mix because it's allowing the bass to contain more of those frequencies. And what I notice actually is I hear that kind of mid bump in the bass that we added coming through more once I add the EQ on the guitars. And by having a bit of separation there rather than a big overlap of lower mid-range frequencies in the middle of the mix, it makes the guitars sound wider. And that to me is something which is a hallmark of a good sounding mix, is when you've got great separation between the mid and the sides, but everything still sounds together. And then that top end boost, to be honest, it sounds almost like it's a harmonic exciter rather than an EQ boost. I mean, I guess if you think about it literally, those are the harmonics. That's like the harmonics of the saturation of the guitar amp that's being boosted there. But that's the way it sounds to me. It's not harsh. It's not bite on the guitars. It's just a bit of extra air and like a halo on the guitars. And like I mentioned earlier, it does tie in the guitar sound a little bit more with that of the drums. So let's take a listen to the mix one more time. And then I'm going to show you what I'm doing on the master bus. So this is it. This is the drums, which again, there's no plugins. It's literally just the stereo out from Contact. And I've got the parallel and the master EQ engaged on the default setup for the Aggressive Rock pack. And then with the bass, it's got the Parallax, and it's got Pro Q3 on it, which is doing this suspension bridge type EQ. That's a new term. And then the guitars, which have this mid cut and top end boost. Sounds pretty decent. I mean, I really like how that sounds. I put it next to a commercial mix, and it's not like it sounds bad. Maybe, if I was doing this as a final mix for a client, I'd definitely feel like I need to do a bit more work than this. But, I might look at adding some extra saturation on the drums, maybe get some of the transients a bit more rounded off. I might use some fancier plugins, some analog emulation of consoles and stuff like that across each of the channels. But I wanted to make a point of doing this with absolutely minimal EQs. And you can see my mixer now, which looks tiny, because we've just got the 5 tracks, like instrument tracks, and then the stereo out and the master. And then let's look here on the master bus, on the stereo out. I have 2 plugins. I've got a compressor and a limiter, and these are both stock Logic plugins. I did this deliberately. I don't normally use these plugins on my master bus, but I think they sound fine. And I wanted to demonstrate that if you're in the middle of songwriting or demoing, you don't need to be reaching for the really CPU intensive plugins, or you don't even need to have the fancy plugins to be able to get a good sounding result. Let's look at the compressor first. I've got this in the vintage VCA mode, which I reckon is based on an SSL console type compressor, whether that's a channel compressor or the stereo bus compressor. I mean, they're pretty much the same thing, apart from one being stereo. So this is a typical master bus compressor that you use. I typically use a plugin made by Slate Digital called the FG Grey, which is also based on the SSL bus compressor, albeit with a couple of tiny tweaks. But I think this sounds perfectly fine. If you are using the Logic one, by default, the auto gain is turned on to minus 12 dB, I think, and the auto release is on, so just be aware of that if you don't actually want that. I don't want it changing the level of my mix arbitrarily, and I don't want the auto release setting, so make sure you toggle those off if you want something similar to an authentic kind of SSL style. I've also put the knee to 0. I won't go into too much explanation of what a knee is on a compressor, but essentially that's going to give us the most aggressive and direct kind of compression, which to me is kind of how these SSL type compressors sound. I think they've given us the knee control just to be able to... Oh, it just moved on its own. I think they've given us the knee control in order to just make it more flexible, really. But I personally just leave it on 0, which is the hardest setting. I've got a ratio of 4:1 or 3.9:1 apparently. That's fine, basically the same thing. I've got an attack set almost as fast as it can go, 0.5 milliseconds. And a release set to 100 milliseconds. Now, I've spoken about this a lot in general when I've been doing my mixing tutorials, the way that I use my compressor on the stereo bus is to essentially just compress when the snare hits, and maybe a tiny bit on the kick drum and the toms as well if they're quite loud. And why do I do this? It's because essentially what happens is when the snare hits, it turns down the whole mix by however much I have the compressor compressing. And what that means is I can get this headroom of the snare above the rest of the mix, so the snare comes through really powerful, but it's not like it's really jumping out of the speakers and kind of taking you out of the moment, which is what I find if I don't do this. The snare comes through really loud, and it's kind of just punching in this very not gelled together way with the rest of the mix. By doing this compressor, I can have that snare really loud relative to the rest of the mix, but the whole mix doesn't get really loud on every snare hit, or rather the snare drum doesn't come through stupidly loud on every hit. And I've tweaked the threshold on this so that the amount of gain reduction is about 3 or 4 dB on the snare hits. And typically I don't want too much more than 1, maximum 2 dB of compression on the kick drum, otherwise that starts to give quite a pumping effect. And it also means that if the compressor's reacting to the kick too much, maybe it doesn't do as much on the snare hits, or the snare hits don't get treated in the same way. Like I say, it's all about the snare with this compression. And something which I like about this Logic compressor, which is also present in most stereo bus compressors these days, is the ability to take away low end in the side chain of the compressor. So that sounds kind of technical, but basically what it means is you're telling the compressor to ignore anything that's happening beneath a certain value. So you have to, if you're using the Logic one, you have to set this knob on the right to high pass mode. So that's going to mean that whatever you set this frequency control to, it's ignoring what's underneath that value. And here I've set it to 100 hertz, more or less. So what that means is that the low end of the kick and of the toms, and even of the bass if it's particularly loud at one moment, is just not going to trigger the compressor. And again, this is my way of making sure that the kick doesn't trigger too much compression. So here we go. I'm going to hit play, and I'm going to bypass the compressor and bring it back in again so that you can take a listen to how much it's doing, and you can also notice how much gain reduction is happening on the needle there. So first of all, bypassed. You can see the needle's not always going that high. Some of the snare hits aren't as hard as others. And it's not actually doing a huge deal. It's not like it completely changes the mix having it there, but it does give it a bit more of a kind of gelled together feel that to me, again, makes it sound a bit more like a record, which is what we're trying to do here. So that's compression. And then finally, I'm using the stock Logic limiter, which is just making the mix loud. You can see here that my stereo out is peaking at 0, but it's not going above it, and that's because of this limiter. So I'm adding just over 5 dB of gain, and I've set the release as quick as it can possibly go, so that this is as transparent as it can be. And that's basically it. I would show you the AB, but you're just going to hear the mix getting quieter and louder. Well, I may as well do it anyway. So limiter off. I guess importantly, you can see the amount of gain reduction is only around 2 dB maximum. I'm not pushing this super hard, but it's enough to make the track plenty loud enough for exporting and sending to people, and it not being really quiet relative to everything else. So that's it. I hope you found this interesting, and maybe it's kind of answered the question to some extent of how much you really need to do to the One Hit Wonder Aggressive Rock pack in order for it to sound good in context. And I think really the takeaway is a lot of it's to do with the context. I think if you're struggling to get it to sound right, it could be that it's just not the right aesthetic for what you're using, in which case you might want to check out the other One Hit Wonder we've got out at the moment, which is the Modern Fusion kit, which is an all-around a little bit kind of higher tuned and slightly less explosive, a bit more kind of clean sounding kit. It's still capable of sounding really heavy, and if you just search on YouTube, people have done all sorts of stuff, including kind of death metal stuff, using it with minimal processing. So that could be an option if you don't have that, or one of our other packs if you really want to get in there and mix all of the tracks independently. But essentially, what I'm trying to get at is that if the drums aren't sounding good, first of all, check out everything else. And the first thing I would say is levels are everything. Get the levels of your guitars and your bass really nailed against those drums, because if they're 1 dB, 2 dB, too loud or too quiet, it can really make things just sound unbalanced in a way that might have you reaching for the drums, thinking there's something wrong there. Like if your bass is too loud, it might be eating up a lot of the kick and the snare, for example. And you might feel like you need to EQ your kick and your snare loads in order to get them to cut through against that bass. And then by doing that, you might have a kind of slightly odd skewed EQ on your kick and bass, which then means that the rest of the mix kind of sounds a bit odd next to them. So you might start EQing first of all like the other drums and cymbals, then you might start adding weird frequencies to your guitars and bass. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. Not every mix needs to sound like this one that I've just done here. Obviously your mix style might come from doing very different processing to what I do. But I'd say if you're trying to get somewhere with minimal moves, focus on levels. Focus on relative levels of the drums as well. I mean, we've given you presets which I think have a really good relative balance between the kick, snare, toms, and overheads and everything. So it shouldn't be too hard. But if you've tried to make your own presets and you've balanced things the way they sound good, and then you found that like the kick's not cutting through enough, the snare isn't cutting through enough, the cymbals aren't audible, just go back and revisit those levels before you do any other processing on it. And I think you'll find you can eke out quite a lot more punch and clarity just by adjusting those, a dB at a time, less than a dB at a time. And I think that's where some of the final level of polish will come in your mixes. So I hope that's useful, guys. If you've bought a copy of One Kit Wonder Aggressive Rock, thank you so much. It's so cool that you're supporting us with what we do at Get Good Drums, and I hope that it's been inspirational for you to create music with. That's really essentially what's at the heart of why we do what we do. If you have created any kind of music or YouTube content or Instagram content with it, then by all means tag us at Get Good Drums. We'd love to see what you've been up to. If it's cool, we'd be happy to share it as well. So definitely share anything you've been up to. We also have quite an active forum on Facebook, the Get Good Drums forum. If you're a user of GGD products and you're not a member there, then I'd highly recommend signing up, because there's a lot of people sharing tips and tricks and sharing their music too, a lot of which is great. So thank you so much, guys. I'll see you next time. And in the meantime, head over to getgooddrums.com for more information about any of our products.